2.4 day 2, we are going to use completing the square to help us write equations in vertex form, okay? So vertex form, if we don't remember, is f of x equals, there's the a term on the outside, and then x minus h, that quantity squared plus k. And we call it vertex form. Why? What can we do in vertex form? Find the vertex right away, right? Okay, the opposite of h, and then k. All right, so it's the opposite of h that you'll see there, and then k. So when we're writing equations in vertex form, there's a couple of things we want to know. We can use completing the square techniques to write them in vertex form. Sorry, I'm just writing this out here. Okay, so we can use completing the square techniques to write quadratic equations in vertex form. And in order to do this, what we want to do is set the equation equal to 0 and group our variable terms. So that means we are grouping any terms that have a variable in them. So in most cases, that variable is going to be x. Okay, that's very similar to what we did yesterday. We grouped the variable terms on one side of the equation, and then we're going to complete the square by balancing the equation. So that means if I'm working on one side of the equation to balance it, if I'm adding something, I have to subtract that same value if I'm working with one side. So when we do this, all the terms are going to be on one side of the equation. I'm actually going to show you a couple different ways to do this. And you can pick the way that you like the best. Okay, but these steps are going to coincide with what your book says as well. And then the last thing we're going to do is rewrite the equation in vertex form. Okay, so your final equation should be of the form f of x equals a multiplied by x minus h squared plus k. Now, in many cases, your a value is going to be 1, and you'll be able to see your a value right away because in standard form, your a value is always the coefficient of x squared. So we're going to know what that is right away. All right, let's read through the directions for example 1. So in the directions, there are 2 things that you have to do for this. So it says to write each equation in vertex form and identify the vertex. So your final answer is going to have those 2 things in it. You're going to have the equation in vertex form, and then you are also going to identify the vertex. Okay, do you guys need any more time with this part? Alright, so we're going to write each equation in vertex form and identify its vertex. We're going to follow those steps. Fake sneeze. Okay, so vertex form, identify the vertex. Those are the 2 things we're going to do. Alright, so let's do this according to the steps that we just wrote down. So the first thing it says is to set the equation equal to 0 and group variable terms. So when you are grouping the terms, these 2, minus 12 equals 0, this would be your first step. Okay, so we're going to group the 2 x terms. Okay, as you get more comfortable with this, you really are just going to jump down to the next step, which is putting in those blank spaces. So this is very similar to what we did yesterday. The only difference is both of the blank spaces are on the same side of the equation. So we're going to talk about that. All right, so to fill in this blank, we're going to use the same formula that we did yesterday. Okay. Yessa, do you remember what formula we used to fill this in?
B over 2 squared.
Good. Okay, so to complete the square, we're going to use b over 2 squared. So in this case, our b is 16. So 16 divided by 2 is 8. So 8 squared is going to be 64. And like I said, you guys can choose how you want to write it here. Okay, you could write it as 8 squared or you can write it as 64. But now that we're on the same side of the equation, if I add something to this side, I'm going to have to subtract it. So with equations and with balancing equations, the rule that is most talked about is if I add something to one side, I add it to the other, right? So if I added 64 to this side of the equation, could I add 64 to this side? Yeah, okay, but then how would I move that over to the same side? Subtract it. So that's really what we're doing. It's just we're cutting out that step of having it to both sides and then having to move it back over. So if you're on one side of the equation, instead of doing the same thing, you do the what? 64 and negative 64 are what? Opposites. Okay, and the reason why is because 64 minus 64 equals 0. So really, did I change the value of this if these are going to make 0? No, right? If I add 0, it doesn't change it, and that's what I did. The reason why I'm rewriting it in this form is so that I can factor using my special pattern. Do you guys remember the name of the special pattern? PST. We're going to factor using what? Yes. Perfect square trinomials. Okay, so that's the PST. It's always going to be the perfect square trinomial because that's why we completed the square. We're making it a perfect square. Okay, so now we have x plus 8 squared. So again, that comes from what multiplies to 64 but adds to 16? 8. So that's what, and it's plus because this is plus. So you can think of it as factoring, or remember the pattern we talked about yesterday? This value here is always going to be what? Yes, it's always going to be half a b. And that's why I like to write it like this. Good. Now we're just going to finish the rest. So what's negative 12 minus 64? Yeah. Okay, and then it is like it equals 0. Your last step is going to be to write it in vertex form. So vertex form is just f of x equals x plus 8 squared minus 76. And then we're going to pick out the vertex. Okay, and then Gwen, can you tell me what the vertex is going to be for this? Or let me know if you're, do you know one part of it, you think? Okay, so the vertex is going to be your HK, right? So this is going to be your H value. There's a special thing we have to do, though. Yeah, do you remember?
The opposite.
Yeah, so this is going to be negative 8. And then do you remember where the K comes from? Yep, it's the negative 76. Okay, so your vertex is negative 8, negative 76. And this whole thing is going to be your answer here. Okay? All right, what questions do you guys have for me on part A? Yeah?
Why do you change the sign of the 8?
Oh, for the vertex?
Yeah.
So your vertex form, remember, is the x minus h. So it's the opposite of that value. So really, because the equation is x minus, this, what's here, the value is x minus negative 8. That's why the value is negative.
Oh, so like it would technically be negative.
Yes, and it really just goes back to this form. So because you have the minus here, we know that it's the opposite. part B. Okay, so you guys do part B based on what we did for part A. All right, let's walk our way through this. So, Cooper, tell me what you did first.
Well, I kind of skipped the first step.
That's okay. You can tell me what you did.
So I set it up and I put in parentheses x2 minus 24x.
Did you, by any chance, did you do this, like to start? Did you group them like that?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's what I'd recommend. That's what I did first, too, is I just group them right away. And then, yeah, okay, so go ahead. Equals.
Yeah, so I did x2 minus 24x. And then I did plus blank.
Yep, good.
And then after that, I did plus 145 and then plus 1.
Great. Okay, but yes, that's exactly what I want to know. Perfect. Okay, and then, Seth, how am I going to fill in those blank spaces? Tell me the process. Good, okay, so then when you do b over 2, what'd you get? Close. I want you to tell me it's negative.
Oh, negative.
Yep. Yes, and then when you squared it, what'd you get?
144.
Okay, so then where'd you put the 144?
Both the missing places.
Okay, so you put 144 here, and then you put 144 here?
Yep.
Just like that?
Yep.
Okay, so if you add 144 here, and these are on the same side, what you want to do for this one is subtract it. Did you put the negative?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yes. Okay, so again, just double check, make sure that these two are opposites here. And it is because we're on the same side, right? And I know the first thing is setting it equal to 0. I'm also fine if you want to keep this as f of x equals, okay, instead of the 0. So some of you might have just naturally done that. That is perfectly fine. Okay, so now we're going to go to the next one. And then, Sam, will you help me with this step? What do we do? Yeah? Did you factor it?
I did not get it.
Okay, yeah. So do you want to do it together? You want to tell me what you think it might be?
Oh wait, what do you mean? No, wait, x minus 12 squared.
Yeah. So x minus 12, that quantity squared. Great. Okay, and again, you can think of this a couple different ways. You can ask yourself what multiplies to 144 and then adds to negative 24, or you can remember, hey, this is always going to be half of b, and that's why I put this underneath it, because I like to avoid thinking about the factoring if I know this pattern, right? This is going to be the same here. And then all I have to do now is combine my like terms. So 145 minus 144 is what? 1. So this will be plus 1. Okay, so go ahead and tell me what the vertex is for this one. Yes, 12 and 1. Good. Okay, so the opposite of what you see, so the opposite of that negative, but then the outside one is going to stay the same. Excellent. Okay, good. Do you guys have any questions? questions for you about that one? So remember I told you I was going to show you two different ways? I was going to show you how you can do this like we did yesterday, and like if the opposite was kind of messing you up. Another way you could do it is, remember yesterday how we put everything on one side of the equation? So if you had x squared minus 24x plus 145 equals 0, if you wanted to set this up like we did yesterday, you could do the plus blank. You could move the 145 over. And if you wanted to do it exactly like we did yesterday, we could. So again, we just did this, the negative 12 squared. So if you want to think of this as, oh, I add 144 here, I add 144 here, you could absolutely do that. I'm fine if you use it this way. The only difference is now you have this negative 1 here that you would have to add over. So you would have to do that other step, which again is fine. And then you'd still get your same answer. So if you're like, yeah, that negative's kind of messing me up a little bit, I'd rather do it like we did yesterday and then move it over, absolutely. Okay? Pick what works for you. Okay? All right. Let's talk about what if A is not 1. Because remember, we can only complete the square if our A value is 1. If it's not, then we're going to do our favorite thing. We must factor. Factor. But there is a little stipulation to it. Okay? So we have to factor the coefficient out of the first two terms. Okay, so it's the first two terms. And when it says we're factoring out the coefficient, what that means is we are factoring out the A value and the A value only. Okay, we're factoring out the A value and the A value only. Okay, so a lot of the steps are the same. The first thing we would do, just like we did last time, is group our variable terms together. Now, the reason why I said this is a little different than how we usually factor, we usually would factor out the GCF. We're not going to do that. We're only factoring out the A value. Okay, so the A value, Aurora, can you tell me what the A value is for this one? No, the A value is only going to be the number, the 3. Okay, so the A value is always in front of the x squared. The A value is just the 3. And so we're only going to factor out the 3. So let's set that up. So I'm going to keep this as my f of x equals. And the only thing I'm going to factor the 3 out of are my first two terms. Okay? Okay, so Dane, if I factor the 3 out, what's left inside the parentheses?
X squared
Yeah.
minus 6x.
Yeah. Good. And then the plus 7 is just going to stay here. And really, I could have done this step at the same time, but I don't want to give you too much. We're going to do the plus blanks now. And we're going to fill them in just like, well, the first one, just like we were doing before. Okay, don't fill in the second one because something special is happening here. Okay? So fill in the first blank like we normally would. And then Jack, will you tell me what you got for this blank and how you got it?
Yes. So that would be just 9.
Yeah?
So that one's just opposite of -6. Half of that, so that'd be -3, and then that second power is 9.
Perfect. Okay, so half of -6 is -3. We square it, we get 9. Now, what is different about this is we have this A value that's not 1. So remember, when you have a number in front of parentheses, this is the distributive property, right? When I distribute, I multiply 3 by x squared, I multiply 3 by -6x, and I multiply 3 by 9. So if I use the distributive property, I have to keep in mind that I didn't just add 9, I added 3 times 9, which is what? 27. So if I add 27 here, I have to subtract it here. And I'm just going to write myself a little reminder that what I did. Excuse me. What's Glenn doing over there? Okay, so you distribute the A value. Okay, because of that property. So if 3 is in front, you have to remember the 3 times 9 is 27. So if I'm adding 27, these still have to be the opposite. So if I add and subtract, they are the opposite. The reason why that's important is because it adds to 0. All right, now your next step is the same, where you need to make sure that you are factoring. Okay, so when you factor this, it's going to be x minus 3 squared. 7 plus negative 27 is negative 20. And then will you guys pick out your vertex? And then I want you to do part B. And we'll just check in to make sure you did that right. All right, so let's make sure we picked out our vertex correctly. Danny, what did you get for your vertex?
Negative 1, negative 3.
Oh, sorry, for this one.
Oh, for the other one?
Yes.
3, negative 20.
Good. Okay, so we got the opposite and then as it is. All right, now we are going to go to part D. Okay, and then like I said, your first step can be right here. All right, and then Kaden asked, can you tell me what I do next? Good, okay, so I'll have 2, and then can you tell me what's left inside? Good, x squared plus 2x. And then if you guys want, at this step, you can put like your blanks there. You can do that in one step, that's perfectly fine. Okay, and then Kaden G, how do I fill in my blank space here, this first one? Oh, that's okay. Yeah. Okay, good. So take half of 2, which is what? 1, and then we're going to square it. So 1 squared is going to be 1. Perfect. Okay, and then Luke, how do I fill in this blank?
You have to distribute the 2 into the other one.
Yeah.
So you do negative 2.
Good. So really what I did here is I added 2, so I have to make sure I subtract 2. All right. And then my final step, Rashawn, can you tell me what I have?
You factor the x values.
Yeah, okay. So what did you put the 2 on the outside?
Yeah.
Okay, and then what was your factoring?
Plus 1 squared.
Good. And what do we have out here?
Negative 7.
Perfect. All right, so then, Emmy, what would my vertex be from this?
Negative 1, negative 7.
Good. Negative 1, negative 7. Great work, guys. All right, so like I said, I'm going to give you the rest of the time to work on your 2.4. I'm going to check all of 2.4 tomorrow. So if you already did day 1, keep it. I'm going to check it tomorrow with day 2. And then you can start on day 2. And then you can go back to day 1 if you need to. I'm going to put that up from the calendar.